Imagine waiting 2 weeks to know if you got a like or not, or a thumbs up. In the decades before the internet, people made comics, and we reached out to each other. What was it like? This is the Sequential Artists Workshop, and these are the 90s mini comics oral history archives. Come join us as we take a longer look at those analog days when communication was a lot slower, maybe more deliberate, maybe more reckless. Who knows? It was just different. Join us as we take a look and really notice how much things have changed. Come join us on the socials. Sometimes it's Comics Workshop, sometimes it's Saw Comics. Either way, come check us out and welcome. Hi, this is Tom Hart. A little context for this interview. Dave Lasky and I have been friends for 30 years. We knew each other in Seattle in the early 90s. We were young cartoonists together in Seattle. We got together regularly with 5 or 6 or 7 other young cartoonists our age, and also sort of hung around the larger scene in Seattle, which was full of cartoonists of many ages, largely brought there by the gravity of Fantagraphics publishing. So hopefully that gives you a little context, and hopefully this isn't too in-jokey or anything like that. Usually Dave's pretty open and clear about a lot of the things he's trying to get across, and I tried to give him that space, and I hope that comes across in this interview. Thanks.
So my name is David Lasky, and what was the second thing? Publications. So I started making mini comics called Boom Boom. Just the first one I made was called Boom Boom, and I just kept going with that name for the most part, and went from like a little 4x5 type of mini comic to half letter, should be 5.5 by 8.5 digest size, we called it. Boom Boom series, self-published. After a few years, had a commercially published comic book called Boom Boom. And later in the late 90s did Urban Hipster Comics, which only lasted 2 issues. Boom Boom, there were about a dozen different Boom Boom comics, I would say. And made other little not Boom Boom comics, but consistently Boom Boom was the title I had in the 90s. And was it, where did I produce them?
Yeah, where were you located, and also how would you describe that work?
Okay. Started out, grew up in Northern Virginia in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. In high school in the 80s, I was drawing on comics on loose leaf paper, not reproducing them. It didn't occur to me to reproduce them. I would just draw one comic on a piece of paper and pass it around to people. And that was really where I started doing any kind of cartooning. I went to college where comics was discouraged. I mean, a lot of people in our time now, it's I should say the date, it's July 9th, 2023. And comics are largely encouraged in schools, which is different from the 80s, where, especially at my college, I was majoring in fine art, and they were into the traditional oil painting, watercolors, drawing with charcoal. So I got a really traditional fine arts education, drawing from models, from still lifes. But comics was really kind of seen as trash. It was frowned upon to want to do comics. And I didn't do a whole lot of comics during that time, but I was always reading comics and thinking about someday I would like to do comics. like that I would like that to be my career, but I wasn't getting preparation other than practicing drawing and some practice in writing and reading lots of English literature. So it was the year after college where I started trying to really make comics. At first, trying to make a comic book that maybe Fantagraphics or some small publisher would want to publish. I was, a huge fan of Love and Rockets. That was the Hernandez brothers were really inspiring. So I wanted to ideally do something like they did, have a series in black and white with Fantagraphics. But I wasn't, I hadn't been practicing comics. Like the Hernandez brothers started drawing comics when they were little kids and just never stopped. And I didn't realize that. I thought, I can draw, I can write a little, I can just jump into this thing and start making great comics. And it didn't work that way. I needed to practice for many years to get good at it. And I think having a lot of optimism helped. Like if someone had said, you've got to work at this at least 10 years before you get good, and you'll probably never be as good as the Hernandez brothers, I might have just quit. But nobody was telling me that. I was like, if I keep trying, something's going to happen. I'm going to get better. And that kind of, uh, optimism where I thought, there's no way I can fail at this. It just kept me going in ways that I think if I was a more sensible person, I would have kind of weighed everything and said, maybe comics is not a good career to go into. But I loved it so much that I think that love of the medium drove my optimism, or just drove a desire to get better at comics and keep going with it. So I was working with a friend from college named Paul Bonelli on 2 issues of a series we were pitching to Fantagraphics and other publishers at the time. I don't even remember who was around besides Fantagraphics, like maybe probably not Last Gasp, but maybe we pitched to Drawn and Quarterly. There were little publishers. Not all of them like Fantagraphics. Some of them were more like trying to be more commercial for comic book stores. We just pitched to everybody. We thought everyone who wasn't Marvel or DC who seemed like they might pay us to make comics, and they all rejected us. And the comics I was making, they were written by Paul, and I was not feeling especially excited about them, but I didn't have any ideas at the time. I didn't think I could write stories. So I was looking for people who would write comics for that I could draw. So I just kind of did Paul's stories, did my best as the artist to kind of bring those stories to life. But I had no, as far as I can recall, no actual input in the writing of the stories. And it was disappointing that I made like 2 24-page comics and we just got, rejection letters. And I think Fantagraphics was the nicest, where they would not just check off a box on the rejection letter, but they would write a little note. And it was probably Robert Boyd who was working as submissions editor, and the note was something like, this is better than 90% of what we get. Keep trying, you guys. And that helped. That made a huge difference to have that little note. See that somebody actually noticed what we were doing and said something encouraging. But I pretty much, after drawing 2 issues, like 48 pages of comics and nothing happening, I would have given up pretty much right there, except that, and maybe I should have given up and gone into insurance or something. But no, I would have been so unhappy as an insurance person. Luckily, I was living after college. I went to college in Virginia, and right after moved to the Bay Area, stayed in Berkeley, then lived in San Francisco for about a year, and went to the store Comic Relief in Berkeley, which was like the greatest comic book store I had ever seen at that time. And I still consider it no longer exists, but I consider it one of the greatest comic book stores I've ever been to. And they had every kind of comic that was available in the early 90s, plus whatever foreign comics they could bring in. And then they had mini comics, which I had never seen in my life. And they were way in the back of the store on a little shelf, almost like they were hidden away. And I was like, what are these little things? They were on colored paper usually, and just black and white printing. They were photocopied. And like a comic book was like 9 inches tall, but these were usually small, like 5 inches tall. And I realized this is comic books people made on a photocopier and assembled themselves. Like, is this allowed? You can do this? I was so dumb. It didn't occur to me. Like, yes, there are photocopiers, and yes, you can copy art on a photocopier. But I had just grown up reading Marvel comics and other comic books, had a huge collection, and I thought, this is comic books, and you have to, if you're going to make comics, you have to be published by somebody, and it has to be in this format. And I think Love and Rockets kind of shattered a little of that because it was larger and in black and white. And I kind of expanded my idea of comic books. Well, it can also be like Love and Rockets, but the idea of photocopying a comic book, it wasn't as much that it didn't occur to me as it didn't, I don't know, it didn't feel official in some way. So seeing homemade comic books in a really great comic book store, and like I bought a few of them right away just to see what are these like, and they were cheap. They were like $1 a piece or something. And that was like the huge moment that not just expanded what was possible in comics, but it was kind of like when people talk about hearing punk rock and realizing, oh, I can do this. I can play music with just a few chords, and I don't have to be able to sing or carry a tune. And that was my punk rock moment. Like, oh, okay, I don't have to wait for an editor to send me an acceptance letter. I can make something right now and put it in a store right now. And so that's what I did. Larry, this is turning into a long answer. I don't even remember what the question was. But I started putting out mini comics, brought them to that same store, Comic Relief. And for a few years did that. I moved back to Virginia after a year in San Francisco, spent a year in Falls Church, Virginia, and made this little mini comic version of Ulysses by James Joyce. I had started it in San Francisco and then finished it up in Virginia, living with my dad. My dad had me and my brother living with him in his townhouse. We were both college graduates and moved back with our dad, and drove him a little crazy maybe. but it gave me a chance to really finish this Ulysses comic and do a good job on it. And that got some attention. I mailed it to the Washington Post Book World section, and a book reviewer wrote a tiny review of that Ulysses comic book in the Washington Post and printed my address, my dad's address in the Washington Post, and people were mailing me $1 bills to get a copy of this comic. That was huge. That was kind of such a success that I decided I should keep doing this comics thing. Like, something happened here. I need to pursue this some more. I think those two moments, just discovering mini comics and then a year or two later having a mini comic that I sold a few thousand copies of through the mail, that was it. That told me that I should keep doing this and not give up. Without those two things, I probably wouldn't have kept going with comics. What's the question, like where I made comics?
We have lots of questions, and you've actually answered quite a few of them just in that story, and that's the perfect way to do this. So what I'll do is I'll just figure out what we haven't really hit upon and have you answer some of those. But those are great. And every once in a while, I might ask a question, which is, for instance, you said you sold us several thousand copies of that. That's an enormous number, I think, in that era. You can tell me, how many did you print originally, and how many did you expect to sell or give away?
I think originally I probably printed like 20 at most and mailed them to a few people. Like, I would have, I think, mailed one to Colin Upton, who was a mini comics luminary. So I wanted him to see this Ulysses mini comic. I think I got some replies back in the mail like, "Oh, very nice, David," or whatever. And I kind of thought, well, that's the end of that. Like, I had spent months on this one comic to try and make it pretty accurate to the novel Ulysses, but comically, it's like a 700-page novel compressed into 10 little pages of comic book. And I think I sent the one off to the Washington Post just like as a Hail Mary, like, let's see if something happens with this. So I felt like somebody who knows literature should see this and recognize what I did. And it worked out. Somebody did see, oh, this is kind of a cool thing. So then these orders started flooding in. Like, literally, the letter carrier would show up at the front door with a sack and say, "You're not going to believe this," and stick this sack down on the ground. And it was amazing. So that became my summer job, just going through all these orders and also going to the photocopy shop and making more comic books. And I was really did not have good skills in reproduction and was using, it was like a convenience store photocopier. It was like the worst photocopier you could imagine. And it would have like toner dust on the copies that I'd brush off and kind of smear some of the blacks. And I was just like, oh, well, this is what I got to work with. And so a lot of those, first 1,000 copies of Ulysses that I mailed out were pretty poorly constructed, but it was a great learning process for me. And people would see a copy and say, you should trim this so it's more even, David. They would critique my reproduction skills for the comic, and that helped me learn to be a little more professional about it, a little more exacting.
Awesome. So yeah, you are actually answering a lot of questions. I'd like to ask a little bit more about the technology. What did you do? How did you what tools did you use to draw, for instance, that first Boom Boom? And when you readied it for print to take it to that convenience store, photocopier, what did that entail?
Well, I would draw with what were called Rapidiograph pens. Rapidiograph was a brand name for a technical pen that was a holder with an ink cartridge, if I remember correctly, and a pen point that gave you a very precise, even line. And they were used by like drafters and architects, I think. And I was under the impression that this was what cartoonists used also. And I was using another brand name called Marsmatic, but I had a set of like 8 pens with different line thicknesses from thin to thick. And I was using those and they were okay. I probably also used some disposable pens, maybe some Sharpies to fill in thicker black areas. But I didn't have a clue as far as what actual comics artists used. And later, maybe after I moved to Seattle, started using a dip pen and different pen points or nibs. And that's still what I like to use today, is the old-fashioned dip pen. But early on, it was technical pens, and they would jam easily, they would break easily. And I think I probably stopped using them because they all broke. Like there would be a little needle in the point. If that needle got bent, the pen was broken for good. I'm glad they all broke because the line quality was not very expressive for cartooning. And I should have, I was not very bright as far as, researching how to be a cartoonist. I just kind of threw myself into it and kind of felt like being unschooled in it is better. It was part of that kind of DIY, do-it-yourself aesthetic. Like, I'm not going to believe the experts. I'm going to do it my way and be quirky and explore different possibilities rather than just do what they tell you in the school of making comics. And the schools of making comics back then were like how to be a superhero artist or how to make magazine gag cartoons. And both of those I had no interest in. So I was avoiding any kind of school or technical instruction because I wanted to do something different. And, and that was good. But I actually would have, if I could have looked at those schools of cartooning or just researched more about tools cartoonists used, and it improved greatly from taking what those professionals use, but then doing my own quirky thing with it. But anyway, it was a lot of trial and error with drawing tools. And I used whiteout, like with the bottle and the little brush that was made for typewriter errors. And I would try to use that to correct inking mistakes. And it was later, I think, in Seattle that Julie Doucet said she used white gouache, or somebody told me that. And so I started using white gouache in a paintbrush, and that was a lot better for correcting inking errors than whiteout, which is crap. Can't believe I used whiteout. So bringing Ulysses to the photocopier or any of my comics, I think I would draw slightly larger and shrink it down as I knew comics artists did. And I would make a kind of a layout, I think with Scotch tape, just taping pages or panels down to a piece of printer paper. We didn't call it printer paper, I don't think. It's letter paper. So we didn't have printers for the most part. It was kind of a primitive paste up I would make and just set that down on the glass and made a copy. And maybe the machines were double-sided, but probably not. I would probably make 100 copies of one side of the page, then put the paper back into the machine, put the flip side of the page on the glass, make 100 more copies of the other side. And I would have to, sometimes I still do this, where I have to make a test of, does the other side come out right side up, or is it upside down on the page? And then I have to flip the paper on the glass or flip the pages in the paper tray. I don't miss photocopiers. Just the other day I was copying comics at FedEx office on a copier, but now you can just program it to do double-sided, and it's a lot easier. Machines are more sophisticated than they were back then.
I want to ask you about some of the community questions now, and you can just answer any of these questions. I'd like to know what kinds of festivals you went to and what you experienced there, and also who your community was and who your peers were, and what kind of work you did together and how that affected what you did. Something like that.
Cool. That'll get into moving to Seattle, so that's really important to me. The first kind of Comic Con that I went to as a person who wants to make comics was San Diego Comic Con 1991. And I was living in San Francisco, and it was where I had tried to make comics for Fantagraphics, like a Love and Rocket style comic book, and had given up on that, but was now making mini comics. So I went to San Diego with some of my mini comics and just handed them out to professional comics people to see if something would happen. And nothing happened. It wasn't what I had hoped. Like I even brought a portfolio, like a black portfolio with art samples, and the San Diego was professionals, and they were great. Like I handed a mini comic to Jack Kirby. I'm so embarrassed now that was my only interaction with Jack Kirby, was shoving a crappy mini comic in his hand. I should have just shook his hand and said thank you for making so many great comics. But he was about to be mobbed, so I was running up to him just before a crowd came up to him. Like Trina Robbins, probably the Hernandez brothers were there, but I had met them earlier at a book signing in Berkeley. Gil Kane, I heard Gil Kane speak. Dave McKean spoke. David Lloyd, the artist of V for Vendetta, spoke at a panel or presentation. Like, this was the first time I had really seen a lot of comics professionals in the same place, and it was hugely inspiring. Sergio Aragones, who's always at San Diego, was there just drawing like mad. So Scott McCloud, I bought mini comics from him. He had not done Understanding Comics yet. He was just selling weird mini comics at a table, and that was inspiring. So that was a pretty big deal for me. Before that, I had gone, like, as a fan to local conventions on the East Coast where there's like one guest or two guests, like, Dave Cockrum and Terry Austin are appearing at such and such con. And that was the big deal as a teenager. But to see like hundreds of amazing creators in the same place. Just blew my mind, and it was so exciting. So I moved to Seattle after living back in Virginia for a year. In fall of '92, I moved to Seattle, and I had visited Seattle a year earlier, and from going to that San Diego con, I met Roberta Gregory and started sending letters or postcards to her, and sent her a postcard and said, "Hey, I'm traveling back to the East Coast, but I'm going to stop in Seattle. Maybe we can meet up for coffee or something." So we met up for coffee, and she said, "Oh, I'm going to a party tonight. Do you want to come along?" I'm like, yeah, I don't have any plans. I don't know anyone else here. So I went to this party, and it was a Fantagraphics party. So like I met Jim Woodring, met Sherry Flanagan, met Peter Bagg, Jim Blanchard, who I didn't know yet was an amazing artist. Again, my mind is blown. Like, not only is it a gathering of artists, but these are like the greatest artists who some of the artists I love the most in the world are all living in this one place, and they go to parties together. So that made me decide I want to live here in Seattle. But first I had to live in Virginia for a year and save some money. So '92, I came to Seattle. Through Roberta, and Roberta having parties at her house, I started to meet comics artists who lived here, more people my age who were just starting out, and trying to make their mark and learn their skills in comics. And it was at an early party at Roberta's that I met Jon Lewis and Ed Brubaker. I think Roberta like pushed me over and intentionally introduced me to them, like, these are guys like you, David. And they were like, glasses, nerdy guys like me. But I didn't, at that first meeting, I didn't really hit it off, or nothing clicked. It's just like, oh, hi, you guys. And it was like, I think at the U District Tower Records, like a week later, I ran into Ed and John, and maybe Carlos was there. I don't know. And I'm like, oh, hey, you're the guys from the party. And we started talking, and that's where something clicked. And I was like, okay, I like these guys. And maybe we went out to eat, or maybe we just exchanged phone numbers or something. But that was the beginning of really meeting my peers in Seattle. And through them, I would eventually meet you, and Jason Lutes, and later met Megan Kelso, because we had both won the Xeric grant, one of the early Xeric grant rounds. And I learned about the Xeric grant from Roberta Gregory. Like, Roberta was really huge in just creating community in Seattle. So I'm eternally grateful to Roberta Gregory, not just for making great comics, but for being a really sweet person and someone who builds community. So sometime after like a year or so of living in Seattle, and there was no internet, or there was an internet, but most people didn't use it yet because it was very primitive. So we were like meeting at parties and talking on the phone and maybe mailing postcards. I think one time you had a rough draft copy of Hutch Owen, and you walked across Capitol Hill and dropped it in my mailbox so I could get it, which was a nice surprise. but we were like connecting in different ways, and we kept saying, you know, there's all these new people trying to make comics, and we're kind of the same sensibility. Maybe we should like form a group or have meetings or something. And so eventually that's what happened. And I think Ed Brubaker was probably a driving force in that, because he had done the same in San Diego, where he had a comics group that met up, and they were more professionally oriented. I think Eric Schanauer was part of that group. And so we had this group that met up. We didn't really have a name for it. I think we just called it the Comics Group. And later I think it became known as the Young Cartoonist Group, because we were all in our 20s basically. And that was, for me, like my equivalent of grad school. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was I was in a situation where I was presenting my work to peers and getting feedback, and that was really valuable. At the time, I felt like this is like kind of grueling, and I don't feel entirely comfortable doing this, like opening myself to criticism. And I took it really personally, and I would say, like, I'm going to show you this, but if you make suggestions, I probably won't take them. Just it's kind of form a barrier up for myself, and not feel so personal about criticisms. And I think there were people in the group who could be pretty harsh in their criticisms. Definitely, there were some harsh critiques that happened, not necessarily to me, but other people sometimes got put through the ringer. And you know, because it wasn't grad school, it wasn't a formal situation, and there were no real ground rules about what we were doing or how it should work. And there were some things that were really great about it, and the best thing was that it made me think a lot harder about making my comics, made me be a lot more, it made me have higher standards, I guess, for my own work, which was important. It was kind of hard because I was going from this extreme optimism of I can do anything is possible in comics, and I was just slapping stuff down on the page quickly and getting it out quickly and not caring if it looked kind of crappy. But meeting with all you guys, it's like, oh, I've got to start caring about if my work looks good and if it reads well. That was the biggest question we all had when we'd show our work. Like, does this read well? Does it make sense? Because it made sense to us, the artist, but we didn't know if the reader would get it. So it was really valuable to have peers who would read our work. But getting to the comic festival or convention question, going to APE in 1994, the Alternative Press Expo in San Jose, was the first time I went to a comic convention and felt like everyone here is basically a peer or is trying to do the same thing as me, like make their own comic book, their own vision, and either self-publish it or small press publish it, but we didn't have the desire anymore to be published by a publisher, maybe Fantagraphics, but you know, we didn't want to be part of any comics industry. We wanted to own our own work and do our own unique story, our own vision. So at APE, I think that was the first APE, and met Paul Pope, probably Jeff Levine was there, maybe Dylan Williams, I don't know for sure. Um, but and there were a lot of people who just did not continue with comics, probably. But it was this huge turnout and kind of eye-opening. Like, it's not just this small Seattle group that's doing this, but there's other people in California and other parts of the country who are. It's like a wave. We're part of a wave. Was what I realized when I saw who all turned out for Ape in 1994. And I went to Ape with Jon Lewis, Ed Brubaker, and Megan Kelso. We went in John's car, and it broke down in Oregon. And there's a whole story there. It's for another time. But just the road trip to Ape was a great experience as well. So I think a year after that, I went to SPX for the first time in Bethesda, and that was also a similar experience of something's happening in comics, that it's like a wave that we were noticing in slow motion, I guess. Like, hey, there's a lot of people here, and there's a lot of mini comics I didn't know about, and independent presses starting up. I think Top Shelf was just starting up at that time. And the first SPX I went to, I was like, I'm probably the only West Coast person coming to this, because I had my dad lived in Northern Virginia still, so I was visiting him and going to SPX, and Brett Warnock was there, and I was kind of like doing a double take. Like, he lives in Portland. Like, aren't you that guy from Portland? He's like, yeah. Are you David Lasky? We were like two Northwest people who came out for this, at that time, kind of obscure small press thing in Maryland, which turned into a pretty big thing over the years. But it was kind of a small thing then, and a guy named Chris Orr was trying to really build it into something bigger. So Ape and SPX became places like every other year I'd go to those conventions. And I went to San Diego a few times as well. But, San Diego was, you always felt like you're small potatoes in this bigger industry comics world. And now even more so, it's San Diego's not even so much about comics as it is about movies and video games. But when I first went there in 1991, I would just walk up to the window and buy a ticket for like $25 or something, or $35 for a weekend pass. I don't remember what it cost, but it was, you just walk in and there's all these great comics people. And now you can't even get a ticket because, there's an internet lottery, which people buy the tickets in minutes, and they're paying $300 or more to go to this Comic Con. It's become a totally different thing nowadays, and I wonder if there's anything for a young person starting in comics now. Well, it's a totally different world now, but I don't think you could replicate my experience of buying a ticket and seeing like all these creators in the same place, like Jack Kirby and Gil Kane with Sergio Aragones and the Hernandez brothers, like, and Scott McCloud, and so many more people. It was an amazing experience. And I thought at the time, if this building blew up, there would be no more comics because everybody's pretty much here.
I want to ask you maybe just one last section, which is about distribution. And so the main question, you can take it wherever you like, is did you have a relationship with any particular store that sold your work, and did you have a relationship with any particular distributor maybe that distributed your work?
Yeah, well, I mentioned Comic Relief starting out, and Rory Root was the owner, and great guy. I continued to bring comics or mail comics there over the years. In Seattle, Fallout was the store for cool comics. There was also Xanadu, which was a superhero comic store basically, but they would carry some mini comics as well. But Fallout, uh, owned by Russ Battaglia and his wife Janet. I just saw Russ last night. He's long out of the comics business, but he works in a record store now. One of the things he does. So this couple, I think they started it as a skateboard shop and then brought in comics and music. And they had this space near where you lived on Capitol Hill on Olive Way. And Russ had one half of the store that was comics, and Janet had the other half of the store that was records. And they didn't sell any superhero comics, as far as I can recall, but anything that was small press or indie press, they would try to stock that. And they didn't have mini comics so much at first. They might have had like a glass counter with some mini comics under the front counter. And I said, they're not going to sell under glass like this. You should make a little shelf just for mini comics. And I think he did that. He built a special shelf with small shelves that would accommodate mini comics. And so that, for a while in the 90s, that was the key store in Seattle. And I would go there regularly just to see what are people putting out, what's new from anyone making mini comics, or what's new in underground comics. Like if Robert Crumb put out a new comic book, you could go to Fallout and find it there. That was hugely important. It didn't last, I think, by the end of the 90s, maybe. I think Russ and Janet had sold it and someone else bought it, but they weren't able to keep it going long. And a lot of it was just, the neighborhood was gentrifying, and the rents are always going up in Seattle. And I think selling comics and vinyl records became less and less of a viable option, especially with the rise of the internet and free music and people reading things online instead of on paper. Probably affected it as well. And there were other stores I would mail comics out to, but distribution was more important than stores, I think. Like getting listed in Fact 5 was a huge part of how I got my comics out and found out about other creators around the country or in other countries. And John Porcelino's Spit and a Half, which he started in the mid-90s, was his own distribution thing. And I got a lot of comics sold through John. There were probably other similar distribution things I tried out. Wow Cool, I might have had something with them. I definitely think Wow Cool is still around. Spit and a Half is still around. I still send them stuff from time to time. But Fact 5 was going back to when I lived in San Francisco. One of my coworkers was kind of a wannabe filmmaker, and he read zines like Film Threat, and so he knew about Fact 5, and think brought one into work and showed me like those mini comics that you make. There's a whole section for that here in Fact Sheet 5. It's like, what is Fact Sheet? Like, where do you find this? I've never seen this before. He's like, well, there's this one newsstand on Haight Street where you can find it, and I'll show you. You know, he actually walked me over there one day. Like, this is the place. This is where you get Fact Sheet 5. And I think it was the only place in San Francisco where you could find it on a newsstand. So I bought a copy and immediately, like, and it was just individual listings of people making zines and a short review. There's always a pretty good positive review, and it said, send, you know, $1 and 2 stamps to this address, or send self-addressed stamped envelope, SASE, to this address. So you were mailing out dollar bills and stamps, and a couple of weeks later you'd get a mini comic in the mail from this person you had ordered it from. And so I sent in some of my mini comics to be reviewed by Fact Sheet 5, and then I started getting orders. And so I would order comics that sounded interesting, and I would also get, sometimes people would just mail me their comic and say, do you want to trade? And so I'd mail them a comic in trade. And I can't remember whose comics were the first I ordered. Might have been Jeff Zenik, who I continued to be a fan of. Later, I definitely ordered King Cat through Fact Sheet 5, and developed a friendship by mail with John Porcellino pretty early on. I think while I was still in San Francisco, I got a comic from Mike Diana. I don't remember if I ordered it. I think he probably mailed it to me and said, do you want to trade? And so I traded with him, but it was like a Boiled Angel mini comic, and I read it and I was like, this guy's going to get in trouble for making this. And he did get in trouble, and I wasn't surprised. You know, it wasn't good what happened to him. Like, the legal system was really biased against him, but he was also kind of he was putting up a challenge with that comic book. It was pretty intensely disturbing. In Virginia, around 91 or 92, I got a comic in the mail from Sasha Rakezic, also called Alexander Zograf, who was living in Yugoslavia, which would soon become the former Yugoslavia, and that became a long-term friendship also, and got to meet him in person a few times, and actually go to Serbia and visit his town for a week about 10 years ago. From the start, like before I even knew people in person in Seattle, by mail I was forming friendships, and I got really frustrated. In San Francisco, it was hard to find any cartoonists. At the time I was there were either old underground guys like Bill Griffith, who didn't really want to make friends with anybody my age, and then if there were people my age, we didn't really have a way to find each other. I wasn't finding mini comics by people living in San Francisco. I was at Comic Relief finding comics by people in other parts of the country. The first mini comic I bought at Comic Relief was by Steve Leach. It was called All Steve Comics, and they were hilarious. They were like kind of wry superhero parodies, or like commentary on superheroes, like Peter Parker is bit by a radioactive spider. What really happens? He dies of cancer. It was drawn in a cheerful way. And I was like, wow, this is great. This is the greatest thing I've ever seen. And I don't think Steve really continued doing comics for all that long. But it was a huge influence on me. But he lived in Pennsylvania, and I think I saw a comic by Dylan Williams, maybe. I remembered the name, but I didn't know he was in the area, or I didn't know how to connect with him. There was no social media, no internet. Um, I had heard the name Ed Brubaker. He was living in Berkeley, or I think Berkeley, when I was in Berkeley. Someone said, I met this guy, Ed Brubaker. He's really into comics like you, Dave. You should meet this guy. And gave me a phone number, and it turned out to be a fax number. I just got this big beep, and maybe Ed was just like writing a fake number or something. I don't know. I never knew why that happened, but I wouldn't meet Ed till a couple of years later in Seattle. So I, spent a year in the Bay Area. Couldn't meet really anyone doing comics like I was doing. Went back to Virginia. There was definitely nobody in Virginia making mini comics that I could find. I was just frustrated that I'm doing this thing for a couple of years and I have no in-person community. It's all by mail, which was fine. But coming to Seattle, it was kind of like, there's no internet. If you want to find your community, you've got to move to the place where they are. And that's what moving to Seattle was like. This is where the cartoonists live. I'm going to go there. And that was a big deal for me to meet all you guys and have in-person friends who are doing the same thing as me. And that's why it became like my graduate school, because we started schooling each other in how you do this. I forget what the question was, but
that's always
thanks for indulging me.
No, it's great. Well, we could wrap it up with just asking you what you miss about that time, what you don't miss about that time, and then maybe give us one anecdote about that road trip to.
Okay. Really good. I miss the feeling of possibility, like the comics up until the 80s probably was mostly superheroes or Archie or gag comics like Garfield. And there was just the beginnings of this notion that, there could be graphic novels, that comics could be about anything, really. So Mouse in 1986 and Watchmen and Dark Knight in 1986. That was the year I started college. I was 18, and those three things kind of propelled me toward thinking that a lot more was possible in comics. And then mini comics and zines and things like Love and Rockets gave me some idea where you could go after superheroes or humor comics. And it was like this big, empty landscape of possibilities for comics. And I was so excited to just try everything. I wanted to push in all different directions. Like, what if we did comics about science? What if we did comics about recipes and cooking? And of course, autobiography, historical subjects. And I had a notebook where I was just writing down like my plans, like next year I'm going to make a comic about the history of Paris and a comic about Einstein and a comic about this. It's like assigning myself like every month I'm going to do this thing that would take like 10 years research to really do it right. But I'm going to do this and this and this. It's like so exciting that so much had not been done at that time. And I would also kind of look to Japanese manga and see like, oh, they're doing this and they're doing this. And I wanted to do, you know, they were doing like historical romance or recipes or cooking comics. Like, oh, let's do this, but do an American style way of doing this. Um, and that feeling of it's a wide open medium to explore was really exciting. And the feeling of just being young and being part of a group of peers, you guys in Seattle, like we're going to take on the world. There's so much we can do with comics. People don't even know we're going to really take them by storm. It was kind of mentally how I was feeling about it, and it was exciting, and largely like it all came true in a lot of different ways. Like you can now get a graphic novel about largely any subject. There's probably some that haven't been touched yet, but like everything I dreamed about, it's largely out there now, and publishers and schools and the general public is open to the idea of graphic novels. And you and James Sturm, who are my peers in Seattle, you're both running schools of making comics. Like, I never would have imagined that in the 90s. Like, I think the world came out in some ways better than I ever could have imagined for comics. In other ways, the world sucks. The world has been disappointing in a lot of ways, but for comics, it's been amazing. It's been pretty great. So I miss that early feeling of excitement for the possibilities. What I don't miss, just how hard it was to distribute your work without an internet, how hard it was to self-publish with a photocopier, without digital printing, without Photoshop. Things were more bare bones. It was harder to communicate without email or social media. I look back and like, how did we even talk to each other? Like we talked on the phone, we mailed letters, and how did anything get done? But you'd have an address book and you just go through calling different people. Hey, I'm having a party tonight, or I'm having a party on Wednesday, come on over. And we made it work. Or someone would mail out postcards and say, come to my comics event next week or whatever. It all worked, but it's so much easier now to do so many things that were a challenge then. But I haven't gone fully into the digital. I still love drawing on paper. I love holding a paper comic book or zine. And I think there's always going to be that balance of we advance in technology, but then we realize we've lost something and we go back and say, let's embrace this analog thing and let's see what's special about photocopying or risograph or screen printing. Then like, oh, but we can also use this digital stuff to help us. And I think you got to have that balance between digital and analog, between virtual and tactile. All right, so is it time to talk about the road trip?
Tell us one thing about the road trip.
Well, it was John's, I think his parents' car. It's like a Volvo station wagon, like a mini station wagon. I think it was a Volvo. I don't remember for sure. But we were excited. We were going to this Comic Con, and we were going to drive from Seattle to San Francisco, which was a bigger trip than I realized. I had never done that as a road trip. And the radiator blew out in somewhere in southern Oregon, and we were just on the side of the road for a while. And I think there might have been a payphone nearby, or we got a ride to where there was a payphone. And I think Ed was phoning people in Seattle, say like, we got a hole in the radiator. What do we do? And his friend said, don't let them talk you into replacing the radiator. Just have it patched. Like Ed always had a connection. Like, I'm going to see what we can do about this. But we were still like on the highway in rural Oregon. And we ended up having to get it towed to the nearest town, which I think was Medford. So from the payphone, we called a tow truck. And the tow truck only had room for 2 passengers, and there were 4 of us. So Ed and I had to ride in the car. The tow truck driver said, "This is illegal. You're not supposed to be in a towed car, but we'll just do this so we can get you guys to Medford. So just duck down in the car so the police won't see that you're riding in a towed car." So Ed and I were kind of just bouncing along in this John's car being towed by a tow truck, like ducking way down in the seats. And Ed was like making jokes about it. I don't remember what he was saying, but it was a lot of fun just because I was doing it with Ed. And he had a sense of humor about it. And he would also say, you know, if the car comes loose, we'll probably die. And then we would just laugh. Yeah, we might die. It was, you know, being like 24 years old and feeling indestructible, and having a setback like that, we were just like, oh, we'll get through it. We were also upset. Like Ed was really upset about it's going to cost us a day, but we had left early enough that we could still lose a day and get there in time for the convention. So it all worked out. And we spent, you know, the garage was closed by the time we got to Medford. So we spent a night in Medford, and they were like, I think I had a credit card so I could get a hotel. So they were like, Dave, you're the credit card guy. You got to rent a hotel room. And if they see there's 4 people, they'll charge us more. So just say it's just for you, and then we'll be waiting outside and we'll go into the room later. So that's what we did. I requested a room. I think it had 2 beds, and went in the room, and they all kind of ran in behind me. And that was kind of standard for being that age and going to a Comic Con. You would just pack a room full of people, probably illegally. So we did kind of the same at this hotel in Oregon, and went out and went to a bar and played pool, and just had the greatest time. I think I had more fun that night being stranded than I did the whole time in San Francisco. So San Francisco was fun, but it was a great bonding experience with Megan and Jon and Ed to go through that. I wouldn't want to go through it again, but it was, looking back, it was a lot of fun. That's my anecdote.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. I'm just gonna repeat a couple highlights for anybody, for the AI who might transcribe this at a later date. You submitted that thing to Fantagraphics, and they said this is 90% better than anything we get. It was still a rejection, but like that was a big affirmation for you. And then seeing mini comics and comic relief, that was my punk rock moment, you said. I love that. and that you were getting sacks of orders for your James Joyce comic. Amazing.
Yeah.
That Roberta Gregory was so generous and such a great linchpin, and that in 1994 you felt like you were part of a wave. That's really incredible too. And then the last two things you said, I miss the feeling of possibility, but also the world sucks now, but it's been great for comics. That's terrific.
A lot of things suck about the world, but there's still hopeful things. I just, feel bad for the kids starting out today. How there's a lot more challenges in the world ahead for them. But
it's easier to find each other, right? They
I'm
wonder
hopeful.
about somebody else in their city who makes comics like you did in San Francisco.
Yeah. I think about, climate change and politics, and I wonder what's going to happen with the world. And but I work with kids teaching comics, and there's some really smart kids out there, and I'm hopeful that they might all come together and create solutions for these problems we've left them with. Let's hope so.
Awesome. We'll end it there. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for talking.
Thanks for listening. This is the 80s, 90s pre-internet mini comics oral history archives. This is a project of the Sequential Artists Workshop, or SAW. You can find out more about this project or about the courses we offer, the programs we offer in comics and visual literacy and graphic novels at sawcomics.org. That's SAWCOMICS.org. You can find out how to support this project through the donate button. You can also support us on Patreon at Saw Comics. You can find more of this on our YouTube channel or through various places where you get your podcasts. You can find archives of this at the University of Florida and at our other partner institutions. And waving at you from the past, this is Tom Hart, the director of the Sequential Artists Workshop. Thanks so much for listening.